Welcome to State of the State. I'm John Carlevale hosting this program, and my guest, again this week, is the usual interviewer on State of the State, but in this instance, he is our guest once again, Dick August. Welcome back as guest.
John, thank you. This is the John and Dick Show 2.0.
2.0.
And I'm glad to see that you got the memo from management about what we were supposed to wear.
Well, Dick, I want to share with our viewers that you're going to talk about Ukraine and Russia in terms of their historical relationship to each other and what is going on in the war. So you're also going to be talking about some things related to what is being done or has been done and what is likely to be done. And I am pleased to benefit from your interest in history. I don't quite have your zest for it, but I learned from you, and I thank you, Dick, for that. So where do we start off? You're going to offer a history of beats. So what's the historical relationship, if I may ask, between Ukraine and Russia?
Okay, I think it's important. This discussion really prompted me to ask John for this time because there are people, a lot of people I talk to, they simply say, well, it's that Putin and he wants to take over all of Europe. But they don't understand the background of Ukraine, which is that it was part of Russia. It was part of the Soviet Union. And it really goes back to Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as it was called, before World War I. Yes. After World War I, the boundaries were redrawn for the state of Ukraine, or nation, actually it was a state really, of Ukraine. And the eastern half of that state is ethnically Russian and Russian speaking. Mm-hmm. So it's another one of these artificial countries that was put together, cobbled together by France and England primarily after World War I. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine held a huge supply of nuclear weapons. It was, Russia had parked them there. And there was great fear that if it became a separate nation, we didn't want that to be another nuclear power right out of the box. So what the arrangement was that Russia agreed that they would allow Ukraine to become independent and take away the nuclear arsenal that was there. And in return, we agreed, or NATO agreed, that it would not extend into Ukraine. It would not extend the membership into Ukraine because Russia has always regarded Ukraine as a buffer zone. And the word Ukraine is roughly translated as borderland. In 2019, the Obama administration was instrumental through the CIA in the overthrow of the last democratically elected government in Ukraine, primarily because the president at that time, whose name was Petro Poroshenko, was not in favor of Ukraine joining the European Union, not NATO. European Union began to approach them. And for a very good reason. Ukraine has a lot of natural resources, as you may recall, it's called the breadbasket of Europe because of the grain. And on the eastern side, the Russians had, there was established manufacturing base, so there was a lot of advantage for it to be in the European Union. And there was a woman in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, who was a career employee. She ultimately became the Deputy Secretary of the Secretary of State Department. She was really responsible for engineering this overthrow and installing the first, I hesitate, but I'll use it, a first puppet to run the place. And in current president is Vladimir Zelensky, who, believe it or not, is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. And his background is he was a nightclub comedian before becoming president of Ukraine.
And a very successful one, I believe.
Well, yes. Well, he certainly, you know, he became like a rock star at the beginning of this conflict. So the problem is that NATO has begun making overtures, especially at the instance and encouragement of Victoria Nuland, who was fired from the State Department for one of her unauthorized visits to NATO, urging them to move into
Now,
Ukraine.
this person, Nuland, you're talking about the United States State Department.
United States State Department. And Putin, the president of Russia, has never indicated any desire to take over Eastern Europe. While on the other hand, NATO has constantly moved into Poland, the Balkan states. Finland now has joined. So in other words, the NATO has kind of gone back on the word of they're moving up closer and closer to the border of Russia. Putin has said the deal with Ukraine is non-negotiable. If you come into Ukraine, it's going to be a real problem. And initially, he, I think, sent a kind of a token force into Ukraine to demonstrate to NATO and particularly the United States that this is not going to be acceptable. In addition to that, the fact of the matter is that under the Zelensky regime, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians have been really discriminated against to a large degree. Now, there was resistance from them to the government, but the government began to treat them pretty much as a second-class group of citizens.
And Dick, may I say
yes.
The Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they occupy the area that is closest to Russia.
Yep. East of the Dnieper River. And so and it happens to be the major area for manufacturing and so forth. So the original incursion or invasion, whatever you want to call it, was more of a warning to them. And in response, the United States said, oh, we are going to stand with this democracy called Ukraine, and we're not going to allow that. Began to supply them with armaments and weaponry, and so the thing has kind of escalated, and people think it's ground down to nothing except the fact that the Ukrainians have suffered horrendous casualties. They're just throwing men into a meat grinder situation. The Russians have created defense in depth for the areas that they have taken, and there's sometimes 3 layers of defense. And if you know, the modern battlefield is far different than what we understand about World War II or Korea or Vietnam. This is a situation now because of the technology that's available for observation, reconnaissance and spying of drones and satellites. You can't mass large numbers of troops anywhere without them being detected and then being obliterated by artillery and rocketry and the precision-guided missiles that are available. So the Ukrainians have had tremendous losses, and a lot of their people have left. About 30% of the Ukrainian population has left, including about 1 million young men who would have been of military age. Most of them gone into Poland, but...
Oh, you just anticipated my question.
Yeah.
I said, I understood that large numbers were leaving, but where, in fact, are they going to?
Most of them are going into Poland, and Poland has been very welcoming because, remember, Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and so their roots go way back in time.
Yes.
And so I guess the communications, language difficulties are somewhat lessened between Ukrainian speakers and Polish speakers, and Poland has really welcomed most of them. Now they have gone to some other countries, and a lot of them have indicated because of the damage to the country economically and the infrastructure, they don't want to go back. They're content to stay in Poland, and they don't want to go back. So this is a real problem. I mean, the Biden administration has come out and said it's going to take trillions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine. Well, guess who they're going to look at to pay for that? It's going to be good old Uncle Sam. So I mean, people have to understand the historical context of this, and there is no indication that Russia or Putin want to go into rest of Eastern Europe. In fact, they probably don't even want to go into Western Ukraine. And they are going to stop at a point where they're content, and they're not going to leave now because they have suffered casualties and paid for that land in blood, Russian blood troops. So it's not an easy situation, and the United States is just encouraging it. There have been overtures to peace talks which have been squashed by the Biden administration for whatever reason. People say, well, why don't they sit down and talk? Well, one of the reasons is the Biden administration has squashed any overtures in that direction.
Dick, do you think that this situation could be resolved if the parties actually got together and try to figure out what they're going to do with what happens to be the situation now?
I think it would depend on what the terms are. Because, as I said, Russia has now expended money, material, and more importantly, Russian blood is on that soil. And I don't think they're going to just sit there and say, well, okay, we paid for this in our blood, and now we're just going to say, okay, we're going to go back. There's going to have to be a compromise, and the Zelensky government has absolutely said, no, we don't want to compromise. And the Biden administration so far is backing them and saying, okay, no, we want the Russians to leave. Well, I don't think the Russians are going to leave now. It's more likely that somebody is going to make a proposal that will be, okay, Russians have the eastern half, and then we have a new country, sovereign nation called Western Ukraine or something, I don't know, but like North and South Vietnam, North and South Korea, who knows?
Yes. And the Ukrainian people that occupy the west of where most of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians reside, are they of some other nationality?
Well, no, they're probably Ukrainians, which would be closer to Polish, Hungarian type of ethnic background. But as I say, that part of Russia was always ethnically overwhelmingly Russian and Russian-speaking.
Yeah.
So
where do we stand with this?
Well, I think, John, I think people have to realize, I think we really stand on the brink of a very bad catastrophe, and I'll tell you why. Some of us of a certain age remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
Yes.
And our reaction to the fact that Khrushchev, and that was the days of the Soviet Union, had placed missiles in Cuba largely in response to the fact that we were conducting U-2 overflight missions, which were at the time considered unacceptable. This was before the age of satellites.
And those were flights, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, those flights were over the Soviet Union.
Over the Soviet Union, and specifically over Russia, areas that we were interested in. And finally, when a U-2 was shot down, they would fly at 70,000 feet, and it was thought that the Russians didn't have a missile that would get up there, an anti-aircraft missile. Well, one day they were surprised, and a gentleman named, you may remember, Francis Gary Powers, was shot down. And he was an Air Force pilot, but was, quote, working for the CIA, so that the Eisenhower administration could say, well, this was a CIA operation. Our military wasn't involved. It wasn't the Department of Defense. And the CIA had assured everyone, the politicians, that a pilot would not survive being shot down. Unfortunately, what happened, fortunately for Powers, he was able to finally bail out of the crippled U-2 and did survive. As you know, we ended up...
Wow.
Yeah. So Khrushchev actually installed missiles in Cuba as a result of that, and we had a crisis that finally, luckily, resulted in Khrushchev blinking and then removing them. However... And
that occurred during
62.
JFK's presidency, if I recall correctly.
Yep, and that was also partly in response to the Bay of Pigs invasion that failed under the early days of the Kennedy administration. But people need to be aware of this. Today, the Russians have announced that they are sending nuclear submarines and naval vessels into the Caribbean. There will be 2 nuclear submarines visiting Cuba sometime this month. One of them is an attack submarine, and one is capable of firing missiles. Now, the Cuban government has assured everyone that the Russian submarine is not capable of firing, will not have nuclear-type weapons, but it is also capable of carrying the so-called hypersonic missiles, which cannot be shot down. That's a warning. And there are going to be ships also going into Venezuela for maneuvers or exercises, whatever you want to call them, all summer. Now, people can say, well, that's not fair, we shouldn't do that, but Putin is saying, hey, the Biden administration is sending missiles capable of hitting targets in Russia and specifically authorizing the Zelensky government in Ukraine to use them to hit targets in Russia. And in response to that, Putin has said the nation that supplies those weapons, it gives authorization for them to be used to hit a target in Russia, is also responsible. So people don't realize how this, because right now we're more interested in Donald Trump and his trial and the election. People are not paying attention to what's happening internationally.
Well, I think I'd like to clarify what you just said, Dick, from my own understanding and perhaps our viewers as well. When he says from the area or country that they're being launched from, that would suggest to me that if they were launched from let's say Poland is going to be a target.
Right. And it's not only the question of missiles. Some announcements have been made that F-15 would be flying into Russian airspace. Putin has said F-15s are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. If we see them coming toward us on our radar, we are going to shoot them down, and we will regard the bases they fly from as legitimate targets. And this is getting to the point of gamesmanship where a simple slip can result in disastrous consequences.
Yeah, and we know that that's happened many times before.
Very frequently. Also, France, the president of France has announced that they're going to send military consultants, and I'm making air quotes, to help advise the Ukrainian military on how to conduct the war against Russian troops. So there's now a NATO country sending troops in there. There's also, there was a hypersonic missile attack on a base in Ukraine that was known to have a large number of NATO officers. And there's unconfirmed reports that at least one American general was killed in that hypersonic missile attack on that base. So this people are kind of not paying attention, but this is, John, a very dangerous situation for all of us, and people should be aware of it and start asking some questions about what are we doing here. And I think my overall question is, what is our national interest in Ukraine? How would the United States be affected if Ukraine should announce it has reached an agreement with Russia, and the fighting is going to end, and they're going to have, they're going to cede the area east of the Dnieper River to Russia, and they're going to have Western Russia, and it's going to be over? How would we be affected? How does that hurt the United States?
That's a good question, Dick. But I recall that Zelensky said that he's not giving up any Ukrainian property. So
sure.
What's the strategy to end this insanity? Because I can't think of it being anything but insanity. Well, people are dying left and right. Their lives have been altered in such a way that I'm sure that it's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives.
Well, it has to. I mean, there's vast areas of that country that have been devastated, as you know. And you ask what the strategy is. I'm not sure. The strategy has never been clear to anybody, has it? Zelensky is taking that position because he has the support of the United States, and we're shoveling billions and trillions of dollars into them. So, and a lot of it, people think it's for military aid. A lot of it is just to prop up his government. His government is truly a puppet government of the United States at this point. And remember, before this happened, Ukraine was regarded under Zelensky as one of the most corrupt governments in Europe.
Wow.
So, you know, it was well known that this was the case. And I rather suspect, and again, this is a rumor at this stage as far as I know, I haven't verified it, that Zelensky has already purchased a very expensive villa somewhere in Dubai or someplace. So he's already got the place he's going to go, because if this thing collapses, they're not going to catch Vladimir Zelensky, sitting there in Ukraine.
So, Dick, you know, I mean, what would be a place where we could move toward peace in resolving this? I mean, how do we do it? Are we so locked into being tough guys that we can't make a concession and say, let's stop this because it's not good for anyone?
There was a commentator I was listening to this morning who just returned from 14 days at a conference in St. Petersburg, Russia. He's a former CIA analyst, and I believe he speaks and reads Russian. But this was a conference that was open to a lot of nations. He said there was about 130 nations represented. As you may be aware, the Russians are part of what's called the BRICS group of nations that is looking very closely at the relationship with the United States. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us in America are still living in the 20th century, and we think that we are probably the only superpower, and we can go around the world and tell people what to do, and that they should all become Jeffersonian democracies. Unfortunately, this is a quarter of the way into the 21st century, and a lot of things have changed.
Indeed.
And not the least of which is that we've got a terrific national debt to pay or do something with, and we're spending money hand over fist, much more than the government is taking in. And there's going to be a problem here in this country that is going to be severe. But the overall question is, internationally, I think the days when the United States can go into a country and say, you do what we want, or else we'll impose sanctions, we'll get engaged militarily, or we'll have the CIA engineer an overthrow of your government. Those are your three options. I think those days are gone, because the Biden administration keeps bragging about the fact that, oh, we got these sanctions against Russia. The ex-CIA employee who just returned said, Russia's doing just fine, because the days when the United States dollar gave us that leverage because it had to be used in international transactions are coming to an end.
Coming to an end, yes.
And if the BRICS, the nations that make up this BRICS coalition, are successful in creating an alternate way to conduct international trade, our influence around the world is going to drop dramatically. And the other thing I think that's very important, John, is that Russia and China were not really on the same page for a long time. This whole thing is pushing them closer and closer back together again.
That's the case, Dick, yes.
And people, again, I think people have to be very wary about this, because Russia right now, in spite of our sanctions, is the fourth largest economy in terms of GDP in the world. So they have certainly come a long way in spite of sanctions.
And our nation, if I understand it correctly, Dick, is significantly indebted to China for the loans that China has given this country.
Yeah, well, that's how we finance our deficit. And every year, they keep rolling over these bonds and notes and everything else. And China has a lot of them. And China could very easily say, I don't want to roll them over. I want you to pay me.
Yes.
Right? And to some extent, I think this has started to happen from the reports I've heard that, you know, the sales of the rollover, the sales of these bonds is not going as well as it has in the past. And people have to understand, the interest on the national debt is becoming the largest single line item in the budget.
Yes, yes.
And sure, we have entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid,
Yes.
and we think that the national defense budget is also very important. We shouldn't tinker with that. But the interest on this debt is absorbing the biggest line item in the budget.
That's right, that's right.
And just look at the interest rates, what the interest rates are, they have to pay in order to roll over these bonds.
I mean, it seems to me, Dick, and this is probably a simplified view of things, but we have to rethink what we're doing, and we need to change many, many things, and some of which, you know, you pointed out, and the facts that you made note of, that you know, I don't think that you and I and a handful of other people are the only ones thinking that we need to change our approach to things, many, many things.
Well, John, one of the most important things is we no longer have an independent news media in this country anymore. And they keep reciting whatever it is the administration gives them as talking points or quote news. And if they began to ask a lot of questions about this, people will become more aware. And unfortunately, what's happening is that those media outlets are beginning, what they do, anybody that raises these issues is denigrated as being, you know, they're appeasements for Putin or whatever, you know, and they just dismiss them and say, don't pay attention. But yet, if you listen to some of these reports, you understand. I watched an overseas broadcast this morning that when they were talking about, I didn't realize there were nuclear submarines that were going into the Caribbean. I heard that there was 2 surface vessels. One was going to Venezuela, one was going to Cuba. Now, no, there's 2 Russian nuclear submarines that are going in there, and we know it apparently because Cuba has come out and said, no, they're not going to carry nuclear weapons. Oh, thank you very much. Nice
thank
to know.
you for reassuring
us.
Yes. Dick, we're just about out of time. So if you have a summarize, please do.
Well, how much time do I have to summarize that?
Just about a minute.
Okay, well, what I will say is we have to look at behind the scenes and not just accept the media line that somehow this is Putin is an evil guy, the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, and he wants to take over all of Europe. Look at what's said, look at the reasons for this invasion, and try to understand that simply throwing money at a corrupt government with a puppet head that we've installed is not the way to do this. We should have learned something, certainly, from our experience in Vietnam. And we know how that turned out. And our experience in Afghanistan, how that turned out.
Yes, indeed.
And these are lessons that we seem to have lost. And people listen to superficial, simple answers to very complex situations.
And the theme, basically, of our last conversation was that we really need to look at more than one source to get a legitimate understanding of what really is going on and why it's going on and how we and others are going to be affected.
How it's being reported elsewhere.
Thank you so much
You're welcome. Thanks.
for educating us all. You've been watching State of the State, and please join us next time for the next edition of State of the State.